This video is going to go through part of 6.1 trig functions and acute angles. We're going to talk about just the 6 basic trig functions. So starting with sine, cosine, and tangent, which are the 3 ratios that you should have learned in Math 2. So when I'm identifying trig ratios, I need to know the sides of a triangle. And so when I have a right triangle, I have the hypotenuse and the 2 legs. And so we always name the 2 legs in reference to an angle that we're concerned with. So we'll typically see the Greek letter theta used to denote an angle. And we are labeling based on that. So the hypotenuse is always the side that's across from the right angle. And so that one should be kind of a no-brainer. It's the only diagonal line. The other 2 form that perpendicular side. The same way that the hypotenuse is opposite the right angle, the opposite side is opposite theta, and then the adjacent side is the side next to theta. So hypotenuse and adjacent always make the angle. They're the 2 that are touching the angle. Opposite is not. And so SOHCAHTOA is that acronym that helps you remember the 3 basic trig functions. And so sine is so because sine is opposite over hypotenuse. We use ka to talk about cosine. So cosine is the adjacent side over the hypotenuse. And then tangent, you should remember, is TOA, so that is the opposite side over the adjacent side. So SOHCAHTOA is an acronym to help you remember those 3 basic trig functions, sine, cosine, and tangent. So each of these trig ratios has a reciprocal. So sine's reciprocal is cosecant. So cosecant is simply the reciprocal of sine, meaning if sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosecant is hypotenuse over opposite. And then secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So if cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, that means that secant is hypotenuse over adjacent. And then lastly, tangent's reciprocal is called cotangent. So since tangent is opposite over adjacent, cotangent is adjacent over opposite. And so those are our 6 trig functions. Notice that we have a sine and a cosine, a tangent and a cotangent, and then a secant and a cosecant. So there are relationships between each sine and each function and its co-function, as they're called. But today we're really just talking about this reciprocality of the trig function. So sine goes with cosecant, cosine goes with secant, tangent goes with cotangent. Notice that all of the names are different. Each one has something with a co and something without a co. So that's how I remember that they go together. So tangent goes with cotangent, and then secant and cosecant kind of flip. So sine goes with cosecant, and then cosine goes with secant. And so when I'm given a triangle and I want to find the 6 basic trig functions, I need to know all 3 sides of the triangle. So for example, 1, they give you a triangle, you don't even have to solve it. You just have to know how to label. So remember that the side that is opposite the right angle is called the hypotenuse. So the hypotenuse of this triangle is 29. The side across from or opposite the angle is called the opposite side. So theta is opposite the side 21. And then the side right next to the angle that is not the hypotenuse is called the adjacent side. And so I'm using the values 20 for adjacent, 21 for opposite, and 29 for hypotenuse to identify these ratios. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So that means that sine is 21 over 29. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so that means that cosine is 20 over 29. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, so that means that tangent is 21 over 20. And then cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, so that means that it is hypotenuse over opposite, so it's 29 over 21. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so it's hypotenuse over adjacent, so it's 29 over 20. And finally, cotangent is the reciprocal of tangent, so it is adjacent over opposite, 20 over 21. So in that problem, again, they gave us all three sides. It makes it a little bit easier because we don't have to find a missing side. We just have to know how to label the triangle. For example 2, however, they give us a trig function instead. So they've told us that tangent is 15 over 8, and they want us to determine what the other trig functions ratios are for theta. And so remember that tangent is opposite, oops, I used the wrong color, opposite over adjacent. And so that means that the opposite side is 15 and the adjacent side is 8. Okay, so I know that opposite is 15, adjacent is 8. Just to kind of switch things up, I'm going to put theta down here. So if theta's here, our hypotenuse doesn't change, so our hypotenuse is this side, but we don't know what that is. We do know that the opposite side, so this side would be opposite, is 15, and that the adjacent side is 8. And so since this is a right triangle, what we can do is use the Pythagorean theorem to solve for the missing side. So remember that if I call this A and B, those don't matter. All that matters is that our hypotenuse is C. And so I can use the Pythagorean theorem, A squared plus B squared equals C squared, to identify the value of the hypotenuse of this triangle. So since A we're calling 15, so 15 squared, plus B, I'm calling the adjacent side, is 8 squared equals C squared. 15 squared is 225, plus 8 squared is 64. That's going to equal C squared. And so that means that I've got 289 is C squared, and that's actually a perfect square. So if we take the square root of that, that tells us that C is 17. So our hypotenuse for this triangle is 17. So now that we know that value, we can find the other 5 trig functions aside from the one that they gave us. We actually didn't need the triangle to find cotangent because cotangent is simply the reciprocal of tangent. So if tangent is 15 over 8, cotangent is its reciprocal, 8 over 15. Sine, so remember we're talking about sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so 15 over 17. Whoops. Cosine is ca, so adjacent 8 over hypotenuse 17. And then we already were given TOA, opposite over adjacent. Cosecant and secant are simply reciprocals of sine and cosine. So remember that sine doesn't have a co, so that means its reciprocal is cosecant. So that's going to be 17 over 15. And then cosine has a co, so its reciprocal doesn't. So that's going to be secant. It's going to be 17 over 8. So those are the 6 trig functions. Sometimes we have to use the Pythagorean theorem to identify the missing side of the triangle in order to find all of those values.